Well, welcome to my presentation. Looks like a Hindu to me, interracial marriage in Latter-day Sikh. So Latter-day Sikh, as Paul mentioned, is a biography that my wife and I wrote of my grandfather, Gurcharan Singh Gill, who's the first Sikh we've been able to find to join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was baptized in 1956. It's coming this September, thanks to Janice Johnson's work. And really, if you guys don't know Sikh tradition, we're just really excited to use his story to help introduce these two faiths together. These are two relatively young world religions that have strong traditions of kind of revelatory leadership, gathering and building cities and community, strong theologized family relationships, sacred undergarments. There's so much that we hope people can see and share. We cover a lot of historical ground in this. So my grandpa was born in 1935 in Punjab while it was still British India. At age 12, experienced independence and partition. His best friend was Muslim, the family tried to stay, they ended up leaving. There were some family tragedies as well. Late in his adolescence / early adulthood, his older sister died outside the hospital. It was closed at night. His baby brother died a month after, and so he was looking for spiritual answers. And after coming to the United States, actually was directed to the church. He kept asking these questions, and a Pentecostal friend was finally like, talk to the Mormons. They have thoughts about what to do with people who weren't baptized and died. So they did. We talk about his sort of spiritual and cultural integration into that new religious community, and his marriage to my grandmother, Vilo, Pratt, Gill. We spend a lot of time on continuing extended family relationships and how this family persists with the religious division and develops a strong culture. A lot of his brothers ended up immigrating later, and he helped facilitate that. We spend time on my grandparents' call to lead the first Latter-day Saint mission in India when it got its own mission in 1992. And then talk about his work as kind of a family history pioneer, going to Punjab, finding some unexpected historical records and doing Punjab heritage preservation. For this, we're going to focus on the marriage story. And there is such a cool primary document that I want to take you through. My grandma's roommate, who was Eloise Bell, later the essayist and English professor, had them reenact their courtship and wrote captions. So this is her accounting of how they got married. We start in October 1957. She taught a Sunday school class and he attended it. She noticed him and he noticed her. He walked her home from church and they talked and got acquainted. Soon he came to dinner, even helped set the table. Very hot. Everyone liked him and he became part of the family. They looked over her Treasures of Truth book and they talked and they found out that both their fathers were farmers and both came from large families and both liked to read. And Sunday dinner came to mean Gill at the head of the table. Before long, people just naturally began to link their names together and the big chair became private, reserved property. And she decided to write a long letter home. Then in the spring, they bought the wedding rings and they addressed announcements, India, Mexico, California, Idaho, Arizona, Utah, and then they were ready. And this was the end of the beginning. So a really beautiful story that's engaging with maybe period conventions of how you tell a love story. And it's great. I am a little embarrassed about the big chair part to this day. That's my grandparents. We're going to go through now, same story once more with some context. What's happening beneath the surface of this story they told? All right, so here they are. I think it's important for historians to remember that mostly they just love Sunday school. And this is making meaning for them. It's helping him with these questions about lost loved ones. It's the spark of how they connect with life. But yes, as historians, we also appreciate there's some minds in the field that is ready to harvest because we've adopted a kind of theology of race in the 19th century in these sort of colonial encounters where Latter-day Saints tended to think of race in three colors. We've got these Europeans who are coming in, who are sort of the top. We've got native peoples and their status differences that they're negotiating. And Latter-day Saint tradition both has a promised future, but also is kind of reinforcing those existing attitudes that they're bringing in. And then we've got Africans, and there's a whole world of attitudes there. Three kind of main ways this theology is going to play out, things that are sitting around. As people are just trying to explain the power differentials and maybe preserve them, they have curse theology, where they'll appeal to interpretive tradition around Bible and Book of Mormon to say dark skin is sign of a curse. And so that it's okay that the world is a mess. Then scholars like Paul have talked about how in the 20th century, we're less comfortable with this like lineage idea that if you're from the wrong family, you're just cursed forever. And so we invent a new racist theology where there's different degrees of valiance premortally, and that explains why you're born where you are. People also appeal to these Israelite intermarriage taboos, and we still read those religiously, like marry in the faith. But at this time, they're also often reading them racially. You have to marry in your people. And in the 1950s, my grandpa got to the United States in 1954, and Latter-day Saints are still thinking in these ways. Their mental map is maybe expanding a little bit as some Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans are joining the church in Hawaii. But there's a 1954 Marquis Peterson address to church educators where right after Brown versus Board of Education, he's concerned about civil rights movement and talking to church educators about this. And that gives us a snapshot of kind of one end of the spectrum of how people are interacting with this. And he's worried about civil rights because one, he's bought into curse theology and goes, civil rights is a front for intermarriage. That's the real goal, is intermarriage, and that'll destroy white purity, which will destroy our spiritual power. So we can't have it. He goes to this premortal degrees of valiance theology and actually mentions India. He says, God is pro-segregation. And we know this because why else, how else can you explain that some of us are born in the free and prosperous United States, while others are born in darkest Africa, flood-ridden China, or among the starving hordes of India? And so he's internalizing this kind of dehumanizing cultural language. And instead of saying, well, the Doctrine and Covenants says it's not given that one man should possess above another, wherefore the whole world lieth in sin, this is a problem to solve, he's kind of accepting it, right? There's like an easier way to do that. It's almost karmic, which is interesting to me, that same kind of thinking is happening here. And then he does conclude his speech by saying, if anybody comes to me about interracial marriage, I'll quote Deuteronomy 7 to them. So very much interpreting those biblical passages as applying to race, even for somebody like my grandpa who's embraced this new faith, right? But there's a question of, yes, you're a brother in the faith, but don't be a brother-in-law. So again, they're in Sunday school. They're not talking about this most of the time, but it's always there and it could come up at any time. So that's beneath the surface. All right. They're also courting quite publicly, right? Walking down south of campus, having long talks on that hill by the Heber J. Grant building. I got kind of curious, what might people have been thinking at the time? And I found out that 4% of Americans in 1958 approved of marriage between white and colored people. By comparison, in a much more recent survey, 8% of Americans thought Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. So if 96% of people agree on something, that's a lot. That's really alarming. In my grandparents' reminiscences, though, the peer reception seems to be mostly positive, right? People are largely okay with this. I don't understand why and how. Is it that they had really compelling personality? People just liked them. Is it because my grandpa was not from a dating culture, so he learned dating through church and was always engaging in courtship through these sort of church socialization systems? And did that like make him less threatening? Is it also that this opposition that was so wide among BYU students, right? That subset of younger educational aspirational people, they were opposed, but in maybe a more shallow way than somebody like Mark Peterson, who's deeply concerned about these issues. I don't know, but it's fascinating that they were courting openly in 1958 and like got away with it. And don't have examples of peer harassment. Unless you count the time that the roommates gave him a jalapeno pepper and told him it was a sweet Mexican pickle. These were mostly returned missionaries to Mexico, or, you can see Tita is from Mexico. And he, of course, being from India, knew this was not a sweet pickle, but ate it and said, "Oh, that was so sweet. Could I have another?" And was successfully hazed into the group. So we've got this. All right, this bottom, it was fascinating for me to see this photo in Eloise Bell's telling, because you can see this is taken at a separate time. This is a photo my grandpa sent to his parents to say, "Look, I'm making friends here." Grandpa, this was maybe not a good idea. His dad freaked out and was like, "What is he doing with all these girls?" Because the Punjabi Sikhs believe that different religions are paths to God, but you should probably stick with the one you're born with. So there's traditions against conversion. He's already like really violated tradition by doing that. It's also an arranged marriage culture still. And so dating period is kind of out. Because it's an arranged marriage culture, there's more gender separation. My grandpa was not growing up casually hanging out with girls, except maybe his sister and her friends walking home. That was kind of it. So there's an American image of promiscuity, especially from the 20s on in the Islamic world and South Asia. They may be concerned about. I'm not sure too whether they've heard rumors about Utah and Mormons, but Grandpa, 6 women and you in a photo, really? Maybe shouldn't have sent that home. Okay, we see Eloise Bell on this page do a really interesting thing where she's building kind of the case. This is the page where I think you see most that she knows that this relationship is not totally socially acceptable and is arguing for it and showing them building commonalities. And I think it's interesting when you look, there's an obvious racial difference, but there are other categories of identity. And she's looking at what are the overlaps in some of these other categories. And in fact, there's a whole culture in California. The first Punjabi Sikhs who came over were men who came to do work. A lot of them, it was Panama Canal, and then they came north from there. And under early 20th century US immigration policy, women couldn't come. So you had a bunch of Punjabi Sikhs marrying Mexicans, and there's this Punjabi Mexican culture in California because they come from farms and they eat comparable foods, and it just kind of worked to bring those two cultures together. So we did a degree different and got in a little more trouble because my grandma actually had grown up in Mexico. Her parents were from the colonies. She grew up outside Mexico City, but when you're white, not brown, they care who you marry in a different way in the US. All right, so then we have this one where there's a lot elided here too. In the final slide about the long letter home, my grandma knew that this was going to be tough news to break to her parents. My grandma's papers were mostly lost in a flood in the 60s. After we had finished the draft of the book, my aunt Janice, who's here, found a cache of papers that were my great-grandmother's papers. And she had this letter. And so my wife and I found it. My wife and my aunt found that and my wife incorporated it into the book, where she sort of builds the case for this guy she's met and what's good about him, and he's deeply religious, and they have common interests, and he's got educational aspirations. And then my grandma said, "Sounds about perfect, doesn't it? But here comes the hard part. He is from India." And so she knows in this culture there's difficulties. We don't, sadly, my great-grandmother's reply is not extant. We think that was lost in the flood. By family tradition, it was 11 pages. Detailing, presumably drawing on the kinds of concerns we described earlier, religiously and culturally, that you just don't do this. Fortunately, it came with a 13-letter word from her dad, which was more than he wrote her on her whole mission. He was not a man of many words. He said, "Dear Vilo, if he is a good Mormon elder, marry him, love, Joe." And so you see here the way that religion can operate both ways. There's never just one. Religion creates conversations and discourses. It doesn't actually tell us exactly what to do on most things. And so at the same time, Vilo Williams is going, there's lots of cultural and religious reasons to say no. Her dad goes, okay, but that religion can maybe be a bridge here and we can move on. Also interesting, they sort of go on a public relations tour to win over her family members and the stake missionaries who introduced him to the church, and check, are we doing something good? How do these people feel about it? When they ask her sister about the cultural thing, her sister Amy says, well, I'm a nurse. My husband Chris is a rancher. Everyone is in an intercultural marriage. Don't worry about it. And so I think that great wisdom, for very impressive in 1958. All right, so then we have, they get the rings, they send the announcements. This is another thing where there's something elided. I'm not actually sure when my great-grandparents found out. It was after the wedding. My grandpa said he didn't want to ask his parents for permission to get married because if they said no and he ignored them, that is worse than if he just asked for forgiveness. And so he felt like he should do that. Vilo and Joe did write them after the wedding, and we found the letter where my Gurcharan's parents wrote back, and they begin to establish this relationship and build on those commonalities. So it's beautiful. I was actually recently at a wedding where one of my Punjabi cousins was, she said she was telling a friend, this is from the Mormon branch of the family. Her friend said Indians aren't Mormon. That's not a thing. She said, in our family, we're very progressive. So there you go. We do find in the earliest reminiscence about the marriage and courtship from my grandpa, he is aware, he says, I was the sole representative of the Gill family. So you see the sort of pain of he's used to big communal weddings, and now he's the only one. But for the sake of faith in a temple wedding, he's sort of willing to do that and make that sacrifice. And this was the end of the beginning, but was it? Because I wanted to talk a little more. My grandparents didn't tell me their courtship story. They told me their courthouse story. And this was the one I grew up with. That the day before their temple sealing in Arizona, where her parents were, they went in to pick up a marriage license, and the secretary took one look at him and got very nervous and walked over across the room to the clerk who's sitting at a desk kind of above and conferred with him and came back and said, I'm sorry, you can't get married. We have a law that a Hindu can't marry a Caucasian woman. They were getting married the next day. And so he was concerned and decided to just say, I'm not a Hindu, I'm a Sikh. What does this rule have to do with me? And so she went back to the clerk, who, in my grandparents' telling, lowered his glasses down to his nose, looked down across the room at my grandpa and said, looks like a Hindu to me. So my grandparents called some lawyers first and then went next door to where the lawyers were. They'd found a sympathetic Jewish lawyer who talked them through some options and said, here's what it would take to challenge the law. When they found out how long that might be and that it might not work, they were less excited about that. He said you could drive to Vegas, and my grandpa bears his testimony and says, I cannot drive to Vegas. There is no temple in Vegas. I need to be sealed by priesthood authority for eternity in the Mormon temple. And the lawyer says, I know a Mormon, and let's go get the Mormon lawyer. And so the Mormon lawyer helps them, work with the judge and just finally sign affidavits and say, you're a Latter-day Saint who was a Sikh, you're not a Hindu, so this law doesn't apply. Vilo, do you promise that you won't seek to have the marriage annulled on the basis of this law? They go back to the clerk and it's got a judge's signature. There's nothing he can do about it. He's not happy. Right before the courthouse closes, they get out. They get sealed the next day in Arizona and live happily ever after. It is interesting when we looked at the research. This is a 1931 update of an older law. So Arizona law also tended to think in three races until the 20th century when we realized there's Asians and tried to find words for them. Hindu was totally the word for South Asian. We also found out my grandpa knew this. He worked at the Hindu labor camp when he first arrived to the US, which was mostly Sikh guys, right? In India, because of partition, a term that's derived from the Indus River and used to mean South Asians had come to mean something religious. But in the US, if you're getting paid, yes, he was a Hindu. If they're telling you you can't marry the love of your life in the temple, no, he's not a Hindu. And so we see that racial categories are always being negotiated. And this is happening. People from the Philippines are told they're Malay, they're very confused. That's happening. By way of context, something my grandparents didn't tell me, they'd have run into similar problems in Utah or Idaho as Arizona. I actually found Nevada had a law at the time against interracial marriage. I guess the lawyer just thought in Vegas, nobody checks. Interesting, they could have gone to California. In 1948, the state Supreme Court had overturned their interracial marriage bans on grounds of religious freedom. A Catholic couple had argued that they had a right to receive a sacrament of their church and that the state shouldn't stand in the way. And that Perez versus Sharp case was how interracial marriage was overturned there. All right, there's a brief coda to this story, which is 2 weeks after my grandparents got married. Spencer W. Kimball gave a talk at BYU telling people not to get married interracially. But the reasoning changes. He doesn't go with Peterson and talk about protecting whiteness. He overtly says it's not a sin, but he says the church discourages such marriages because racial, cultural, and economic differences, strained relationships increase the divorce rate. So my grandpa's worried. Did I just do a bad thing here? I bought into this image of eternal marriage. You get married in the temple, that's forever. Now I'm being told you got married interracially, it's going to fail. And he talks to his friend Henry Owasa, who's Japanese Canadian and also interracially married. And they decide, what if we live the gospel and Jesus can help us overcome obstacles? We're probably going to be okay, right? And we're back to like this basic biblical principle that the power of Jesus' gospel is that we become fellow citizens. And so I think it's important for historians to note, yes, we can track what happens over the pulpit. Even as we're acknowledging that things are racist, we can notice there's different room for conversations depending on justifications. Those gradations matter, and the pews matter too. The theology of the pews is part of what allows us to build the next generation who redefine that baseline of what our experience is and slowly change our collective ideas about race. Thank you very much.